Morgan, the cannabis industry is obviously booming as legal recreational marijuana continues to expand, but it's still illegal on a federal level, and there have certainly been issues with companies accessing the federal banking system. Is the industry, in your mind, past the point of no return? And how much do your members have to protect against legal rollbacks? Does that add to the cost of doing business?
Well, I think the cat is pretty much out of the bag at this point. An increasing number of states have instituted laws regulating cannabis for medical or adult use purposes, and those states have seen the benefits of that, particularly when compared to the previous status quo of prohibition. And they're starting to see not only the benefits of no longer punishing adults for using a substance that's safer than alcohol, but they're also seeing the benefits in terms of job creation and tax revenue as well. In terms of potential rollback, we really aren't seeing that much of it at the state level. I think that everybody is sort of waiting with bated breath to see exactly what is going to happen in terms of federal regulation when Congress eventually decides to remove cannabis from the schedule of controlled substances. But that's not something that's going to happen immediately either. In the meantime, I think that states are doing a pretty good job at not only regulating the substance, but learning from their own mistakes and learning from the experiences of other states in order to continuously improve their systems. And this extends to businesses and people involved in the industry as well, as innovation continues to really define this particular industry.
This may be a bit of a remedial question, but what kind of cannabis businesses are there? I know it has to be grown, processed, and sold. Do generally individual companies take it through all three stages, or do multiple companies do it? And are there other kinds of cannabis businesses that I'm not thinking of?
Well, states have a mix between vertically integrated and non-vertically integrated systems in place. And even within systems that, or states that allow vertical integration, not every company is going to do that. Some states actually require it too. But in terms of plant touching businesses, you're looking at cultivators, processors, retailers, and testers, as well as transportation, from location to location. But that's really only a small fraction of the larger cannabis ecosystem when it comes to the economic production involved in this industry. Ancillary businesses that service the cannabis industry run the gamut from plumbers to programmers, basically anything that you could think of that's involved in the cultivation and sale of a modern agricultural product. So every state that opens up regulated markets sees a boom in job creation, not just in plant touching businesses, but in all of these other ancillary businesses that help service the cannabis industry.
As people consider entering the industry in newly legalized states, I'm wondering what lessons can be learned from where it's already legal. Most young new industries see lots of new businesses open, some then fail, others then merge or are sold. Do you have any idea what percentage of cannabis businesses tend to survive a year or two later? And do we know what percentage of cannabis businesses fail and why they fail?
I don't think that there are that many reliable sources of data in terms of how long the average cannabis business lasts and their turnover rate. What we do know is that one of the biggest problems that they encounter is lack of access to capital, particularly smaller businesses. Larger businesses tend to have access to angel investors and deep financial networks, whereas smaller businesses tend to rely on friends, family, and personal generational wealth, as well as traditional lending sources. And unfortunately, because of current banking restrictions, most traditional lending sources are pretty much off the table. And then when you combine that with the negative impacts of prohibition on the ability for marginalized communities to develop generational wealth, that makes it even harder to be able to survive in this difficult political and regulatory environment. That being said, I think that anybody that is looking to get into the industry on the plant touching side needs to be very cognizant of the incredibly strict and complicated regulations that govern those markets in every single state, and the fact that there's variety between exactly how states control these markets. I also like to tell people that when you're looking to get into the industry, don't necessarily concentrate on plant touching businesses if you don't have direct experience in those fields, particularly if you don't have access to capital or you don't have much experience in cannabis overall. for instance, if you don't have retail experience, it might not be the best idea to try to open up a dispensary. What I suggest is that people try to take their existing skill sets and then try to figure out ways to apply them to the cannabis industry in ways that help plant touching businesses or other ancillary businesses. And those options tend to be much less strictly controlled by regulatory structures at the state level and require much less overhead in order to start. Regardless, there's a lot of opportunity to be had in both plant touching and non-plant touching businesses in regulated markets. We just have to get to a point in state regulated markets where the barriers to entry are lower than they are now, and where businesses that are just starting up have better access to capital if they don't necessarily have access to angel investors or venture capitalists.
One of the bigger surprises to me, Morgan, is that big companies from other fields have not entered the industry, at least not yet. I know some beer and tobacco companies have formed partnerships with Canadian cannabis companies. I'm wondering why they haven't entered the U.S. market, if you think they will, and would that be good or bad for the overall industry?
Well, I think you are seeing some big companies getting involved in cannabis, not necessarily from the beer and spirits and tobacco to a great extent. Although I think largely their lack of direct involvement is because they don't have the infrastructure for a product that is federally illegal and basically controlled by a patchwork of state regulations, but also because it's very difficult to become publicly traded in the United States if you're dealing with direct cannabis products. You are seeing a lot of involvement from other things like companies that grow or that have growing mediums or that produce things like topsoil or grow lights and all of these other things that help supply the cannabis industry that weren't necessarily directly involved in it before and are starting to realize that there's a lot of opportunity with this new market opening up where they can intersect with their existing businesses nicely.
On the sales side of the cannabis industry, we're hearing estimates that New York could do $4 billion in business in a year. We know Illinois just did $1 billion in 1 year. I'm curious about what I'll call the Atlantic City casino effect. Atlantic City had a monopoly on East Coast gaming, but the bottom fell out once casinos opened in nearby states and there was competition to that exclusivity. Here on the East Coast, we could see legal recreational cannabis from Maine to Virginia within a few years, which could lower both sales and revenue, at least as compared to those estimates. How big a concern should that be for people considering entering the market?
I really don't think that it should be that much of a concern at all. Outside of perhaps people that are operating retail establishments that are right along the border of states that either do not currently have legal markets or haven't set them up yet, or in the process of doing so, because those particular businesses stand to lose a little bit of their cross-border customer base. But overall, it's really not that big of an issue at the moment. Under federal law, it's basically impossible to do any interstate commerce with cannabis, and that creates sort of a silo effect within each state. Once cannabis is descheduled at the federal level and interstate commerce is allowed, that might mean that there's going to be more competition in nearby states, but it also means that you'll be able to do much more traditional agricultural commodity business, both within the country and internationally.
Morgan, the New York marijuana law contains a social equity component with half of all licenses designated for minority and women-owned businesses, for distressed farmers, disabled veterans, and also giving a boost to impacted neighborhoods and communities. Do you know if there are similar requirements in other states? And is there any way of knowing how that'll impact the overall industry? Might that restrict the ability of the market to sort of sort itself out?
Well, the biggest restrictor on the market is arbitrary license caps in every state. We're getting to a point now, and rightfully so, where you can't have a conversation about legalization without talking about the racially disproportionate harms that prohibition has caused and trying to find ways to help repair those harms through a variety of different methods, but most of them relating to community reinvestment as well as improving diversity within the cannabis industry and making sure that social equity applicants have the support in order to be able to succeed. That comes in a lot of different forms. New York's, on paper, is one of the better programs, both because of the large amount of the tax revenue that's being specifically diverted towards community reinvestment and restorative justice measures, but also the licensing carve-outs. But when you have a limited number of licenses to begin with, it really limits the effectiveness of those programs. There are several other states that are operating similar programs to varying degrees. And unfortunately, none of them have really been that successful. So there's definitely a learning curve there. And I think that state lawmakers and advocates are slowly starting to determine which programs work and which ones don't, and the ways in which to make sure that programs work in perpetuity.
Finally, Morgan, I wanted to ask you about the cannabis customer base. It seems safe to assume that people who use marijuana recreationally while it's still illegal will probably become customers once it's legal. And I'm sure there will be some who used to use it who begin using it again once legalization comes. But that strikes me as being a fairly limited set and a limited number of potential customers. I know that there are some restrictions on advertising. So how does the industry grow the customer base, or has that question not really been answered yet?
Well, the customer base is already there. The key is in making sure that legal regulated businesses are able to effectively compete with the unregulated market that those customers are used to patronizing. And a large amount of the inability for legal businesses to do that is because of things like not being able to access banking, incredibly high tax rates at both the state and federal level, exorbitant regulatory costs associated with staying in compliance with all the various state regulations and rules. So we need to find a balance point where these programs are paying for themselves and their own administration, repairing the harms caused by the war on drugs, but are not taxed so heavily and hit with so many exorbitant fees that they're unable to survive while still being competitive at a price point against the unregulated market. And there's a relatively large subsection of the consumer base for whom price is the bottom line. So that is something that needs to be addressed. And I think that oftentimes there are little roadblocks in the form of state lawmakers and regulators who really want to try to squeeze as much tax revenue as possible out of this industry without really realizing that by lowering the tax rates, they'll be able to generate much more tax revenue long term because more sales will take place in the regulated market.
Morgan Fox, Media Relations Director for the National Cannabis Industry Association. Really appreciate it, Morgan. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.